All rise. All right, please be seated. Okay, John.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Cross, I'd like to start with two things that I believe you may refer to at least one of these in your report. You agree that the testing was done correctly in this case. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes.
And you agree with the statistical reports in the STR and the YSTR reports?
Yes, I do.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about your background. You are with, let's see, Guardian Forensics, correct?
That's correct.
And is that a certified lab?
Yes, it is.
And when did you do your last personal testing on DNA material?
Last week.
And when did you have your last proficiency test?
That was within the last 6 weeks.
And have you ever performed any testing on YSTR?
Yes, I have.
And when was that last done?
That was probably done about 6 weeks ago.
And have you done that for forensics, medical, or research?
That would be forensics.
You mentioned that you are the technical leader of consulting. How many, I believe it was, was that how you characterized your position?
No, I'm the DNA technical leader, but
That's
I'm
it.
also an analyst.
Okay. And how many people are you the leader of?
Right now, there are just 2 of us.
And how long have you been with Guardian Forensics?
Since 2011.
Have you been utilized by any law enforcement agencies?
Yes.
And have you ever had any training or been certified to use the True Allele program?
No, I have not.
So you have no expertise as it relates to genotype, probabilistic genotyping.
Now, I have had training in probabilistic genotyping, the theory, and I do routinely review true allele cases. However, I do not actually have the hands-on training with the software itself.
So you could not run a test using that type of analysis.
I cannot run a test using that software, no.
And have you ever been found to be an expert in the field of DNA interpretation?
Yes, that is a part of DNA analysis
As it relates to probabilistic genotyping?
as it relates to I have testified to review of probabilistic genotyping.
But have you
That
tested?
term has never been used before.
So you have never testified as an expert on the issue of true allele?
Just the review of their work.
So to answer my question, you have never testified as an expert as to true allele testing. You may have reviewed it, but you have never
I have never testified as
an
to
expert.
having run a true allele test.
So have you testified as an expert on true allele?
I'm not sure how to answer that question because I have testified as to the work from true allele. I have not run the test myself, so I cannot be qualified as an expert in that system.
So the answer to my question is, no, you have not testified as an expert in true allele. Since you're not qualified to run it, you have not testified as an expert, correct?
As to drawing my own conclusions after running a test, no, I have not.
Thank you. Now, on the issue where you were describing the 4 samples, I believe you mentioned the left breast, the left bra, the waistband, and the inside window. If I understood you, could you describe again what you looked at when you were coming to your conclusions as it related to those samples?
I looked at the electropharogram data that the analyst used to come to her conclusions. And from that, I was able to remove any alleles that could be attributed to the victim and looked at those foreign alleles and compared them to each other.
The information that you relied on was below the accepted standard to be compared by the Metro Crime Lab, one to another, correct?
I looked at data that was called by the computer in their case file. Their case file did not have any allelic tables, nor did it have any sort of threshold standard. The generally accepted practice in forensic science is if it's printed and computer called, then it's accepted, because if they don't use it, there is a strike through and a reason given, and those were noted on the electropherograms when peaks had been removed.
But you had access to Ms. Mack's report and you examined it extensively, correct?
Yes,
And you were aware that in her report, she reported, she was unable to report comparison of these items due to the low nature of those profiles, correct?
and that is an interpretation based by laboratory policy, not by laboratory science.
I understand. I understand that. What I'm asking you, though, and it's very simple, is you went lower and to lower levels of DNA and compared those that Ms. Mack, because of her accreditation with her lab and their policies, did not go that low. Would that be a correct statement?
No, that would not be a correct statement, because I do not know what their level is. If it's printed on the data, that's called data. They did not produce a DNA table, so I have no idea if it's on the electropherogram that they're not using it.
Does your certified lab have any standards?
Yes,
And what are your standards?
our standards are based on our validation studies as to what is reliable, and we will only print what is going to be used for interpretation.
If this information had been generated by your lab, would it have qualified for your standards under your accreditation for comparison?
I would have to know if this data was data that I generated and was printed out and put in my folder for interpretation, then yes, I would have relied on that for my conclusions.
I understand that, but my question is this. If you had generated that information, regardless of reporting and how things should be reported, but you have done it and you have generated the amount of data that you have, would it comply with your accreditation standards for you to compare those items that are at that level? Or do you know?
I'm sorry, I'm just not understanding your question. If the data is in the case folder, then it meets the standards and will be used for comparison purposes. And that's what you've been asking.
Okay, I'm not worried about the piece of paper. Let's say it never gets down on a piece of paper. Let's just say you get it, you have your results, and you do. It's not a matter of one person reporting or anything else. What are the standards for your accredited lab? How high does it have to at least be before you can compare it?
Oh, are you asking what our analytical threshold is?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's completely different than what you were saying. The analytical threshold for our instruments, and you have to remember, analytical threshold is instrument specific. It cannot be reapplied. My standards cannot be reapplied to this data. I have to use their standards. Our analytical threshold for STR typing is based on the color channel. The blue channel is at 60 RFUs, and the green channel, yellow channel are at 50, and the red channel is at 40 RFUs. Now for YSTRs, everything is because there's only, you don't get heterozygous or two peaks in a single sample for YSTRs. So that one is 50 RFUs across all color channels.
Did you use the data where it stated that it was too limited or that it was partial?
I used whatever was in the electropherogram, which could be partial. Partial and too limited are lab-defined terms. If it's callable data, it's used.
So you have no issue with a lab considering data, even if it's below another lab's threshold?
Well, yes, there is a problem with that, but if you don't know what the threshold is and it's printed, you assume that it is above their threshold.
Let me ask you another question. On your direct testimony, you stated that you cannot tell the age of DNA based on the quantity, correct?
That's correct.
And would you agree that whether you have 10 cells or 10,000 cells, if there is sufficient data for a profile to be developed, it is still a DNA profile?
Yes, that's correct.
The issues involving degradation, you stated humidity.
That's one.
Okay. You stated sunlight,
Yes,
and you stated transfer.
no.
Oh, I'm sorry. Humidity and sunlight. Let me ask you this. Are you familiar with the concept of when a person walks into a place, they may leave behind DNA, and when a person leaves a place, they may take DNA away?
Well, there is a principle in forensic science called Locard's principle that whenever two items come in contact with each other, something is left and something is taken away.
So let's say that you touch that platform up there in front of you, and you leave your DNA behind.
Yes,
And then if I come up there and I touch it and take my hand away, would the likelihood be that I would potentially move away some of your DNA?
yes, as well as leaving some of your own.
Okay. And if, say, over the course of time that spot is touched 50 times, the statistics are that probably more of that DNA is going to be taken away every time it's touched.
Well, a little bit will be taken away so that after a certain number of times, it would either be gone or undetectable.
Now, you talked about your work on Civil War samples and people from the Hunley. What were those sources? What were you actually testing?
We were testing the human remains that were found inside the submarine.
And what part of the human remains were you testing?
Generally, it was bone samples, typically from the large bones, such as femurs.
So you would go inside to the bone and get the bone marrow, which would probably, would you agree that it's one of the richest sources of DNA that a body may have?
Well, yes, bone marrow is a very rich source of DNA, but after 100 years at the bottom of the ocean, there was no marrow left.
Okay. But you went inside the bone in order to get that DNA?
Yes.
And so being inside that bone, of course, it's going to be not directly exposed to the water as much as the exterior of the bone would be, correct?
It is not directly exposed to the water. However, components in the water can leach through the bone.
But you would agree that the degradation would be even greater on the outside of the bone than on the inside of the bone.
That's correct.
And that's why you're seeking to go inside the bone to get the DNA.
Well, there's a couple reasons for that. One, it is more protected, but two, there's also less chance of any sort of contamination from people that may be, collecting the bones, moving the bones, things of that nature. So we want to make sure that the DNA that we're getting is from the bones and not from some other source.
During the course of all of your analysis on the Hunley, did you ever come across any trace DNA that had been transferred from one person on the Hunley to another person on the Hunley?
Not with that extended period of time and the conditions that those samples were under.
So while you gave an example of the Hunley or the Civil War as being how long DNA can last, you would agree with me that it is that the likelihood of that DNA profile being obtained from the actual remains is much greater than from trace or touch DNA.
Absolutely, and especially since when these people died, they were clothed and had, it wasn't raw bone against raw bone, so you weren't going to find that sort of transfer, possibly as things were moved or collected, but at that point, you're not going to see the transfer. It was hard enough to get the individual DNA, let alone
Right.
transfer after that amount of time.
I mean, it wasn't a situation where you might have bodies lying on top of each other and you're having transfer from one to the other. You're working hard just to get to the DNA that's
Supposed to be there.
supposed to be there in the body, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so I guess what I'm saying is I want to make clear, we're not talking about bodies lying on top of each other 200 years ago and you're able to see that one touched the other one.
No, that was purely an example for getting DNA out of an old sample. It definitely was not an example of transfer.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you a hypothetical. Going back to the touch DNA, transfer DNA situation. Let's say that I were to come up to you with my hand and I were to rub you on the face. And I'm rubbing you on the face. And then a very short time later, I go to an object and I touch that object. A hard surface object. Would it be possible for my hand to have picked up your DNA and have left it on that hard surface?
Yes, that's possible.
No further questions.
Correct. Actually,
Ms. Cross, is the concept of DNA transfer a widely and generally accepted principle in your field?
Yes, it is.
Have many scientific articles, books, publications been written on the subject of transfer?
Yes, because of the sensitivity of the testing kits that we use today, it has become much easier to detect transferred DNA or secondary transfer.
In the situation of touch DNA, that the state just asked you about, if someone touches a surface, as they described, a hard surface, and then someone comes along later and touches the hard surface, could there be a mixture of both DNAs on that surface?
Yes, they're good.
Is there really any way to tell if they happen at the same time or separate times?
There are rare occasions that we can tell if a sample is commingled, layered, or came at separate points, but those usually involve mixtures of things like semen and vaginal fluid, not skin cells. There's no biological test that we can do to tell a layered sample from a commingled sample from things that happened at very different times.
I believe one of the experts testified about some periodical that was written some time ago about the likelihood of transfer DNA happening being a low percentage. Are you familiar with that one?
Yes.
Are there others in your scientific community that have greater instances of transfer than that?
Yes, there are. In fact, again, as I've mentioned, we've been doing STR analysis now since the mid-90s. And when we first started doing STR analysis, the sensitivity was not great. So it was a lot harder for us to detect mixtures. Well, in the times since the mid-90s to now, they have increased the sensitivity and the ability to detect the DNA in our kits. So now we are picking up people that have 10 skin cells left behind from something. And the problem is now, due to this sensitivity, we're seeing it. It's always been there. We just weren't detecting it before. And now that we're detecting it, it does make mixture interpretation more difficult. It makes deconvoluting things, even determining the number of contributors sometimes can be very difficult, because we're now detecting things that go back farther in time than what we used to be able to detect. It's not that it was never there before, it's just our ability to find it has improved.
And have you prepared a bibliography of those such publications?
Yes, I have.
Can I show this to the state?
I don't believe you've been provided this as a basis of her.
On the basis of her testimony, it's just in response to the question.
Prepared. Could we approach her?
All right.
All right, Ms. Cross, I was asking you about whether you were aware of other articles and scientific studies regarding the transfer of DNA.
Yes.
And are you aware of such publications?
Yes, I am.
Do you have any idea how many such publications exist?
I know recent research of at least 42 different journal articles that are in peer-reviewed journals. There are probably more than that. These were ones that specifically could be detected from the title or the abstract. There may be others that also touch on various aspects of this.
And given that this is a science, is this a field that is continually evolving?
Yes, it is.
And are there differences of opinion sometimes amongst experts?
Yes, absolutely.
And do you agree or disagree that there is a low likelihood of transfer in every case?
I do not agree that there's a low likelihood. A lot will depend on the circumstances of any given case. Some may have a higher likelihood, and just from experience within the laboratory, I know that it is extremely easy to transfer DNA into places where you don't expect to do it if you're not extremely careful.
That's all.
Recross.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. The 42 journal articles that you referred to, were those ones that specifically deal with secondary DNA transfer?
Yes, they were secondary. They all had an aspect of secondary transfer. Some of them were also involved with direct transfer.
But were they specifically addressing the varying conditions under which it occurs?
Some of them were looking at the various conditions and what can allow it to occur. Others were looking at how many times you could detect that transfer before it sort of dies out, so to speak. So there are multiple different angles that these articles come in, but they're all dealing with some aspect of the transfer.
And you mentioned the article that was referred to by Ms. Horniak, and you mentioned something about the 90s. Do you remember what year that journal article was from?
That particular article, no, I don't.
So if it were not in the 90s, what was relevant in the 90s wouldn't be, what was available in the 90s wouldn't be relevant to that particular article.
Right, and even articles that came out in 2017 might not be relevant to what we're doing in 2019. The sensitivity issue is one that has actually been increasing in the last 5 to 7 years.
No further questions?
Okay, right.
No, thank you.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Next witness.
If I could call briefly Ms. Castelbuono.
I just want to remind you, you're still on, okay?
Mr. Castelbuono, as an expert, and just like Ms. Cross for the defense is entitled to sit in and listen during expert testimony, you've had the opportunity to sit in as well, correct?
Yes.
And have you been able to hear the discussions concerning the population statistics as it relates to YSTR?
Yes.
And if you would, could you please share with the ladies and gentlemen of the jury and clarify what's been said by you and by Ms. Cross as it relates to those numbers and what those numbers actually mean?
Yes. So, like I said previously, the way we determine these frequencies of a profile happening in a population is based on the number of profiles available to us in a database. So the 28,000 profiles that I had referenced in my report was made up of several thousand from these various population groups. So the amounts from each population are not the same. So the particular profile that was discussed earlier, the actual times that profile was observed in that database of 28,000 profiles was 0. So the estimate is just based on the actual number of profiles in the database. But that profile was seen 0 times in that database. So that's meant,
for every race.
yes, for all the races, 0 times for each race. So that number of 1 in whatever, that's going to be the same for any profile put in there that doesn't have a match in that database. So it doesn't mean that that particular profile is more likely to be Asian or less likely to be Caucasian. It just has to do with how many profiles are in there for each of those populations.
So would it be accurate to say in the first, let me find the one here. So in the section where we're dealing with, we'll take this one down here. I'm showing you the summary, and I'm just looking specifically at AP, which would be from the left arm. So this profile from this evidence that shared the same YSTR profile as Roy Coons was seen 0 times out of the entire database of 26,009 profiles?
Yes, this particular profile actually was less, like the other one had 28,000,
Right.
but this was a partial, so
It's even
not
lower.
every profile had those same locations in that database.
And then this 2,083 African-American males, is that just the number of people in that database that has those locations of the YSTR, or what does that mean?
So that number is an attempt to sort of apply, sort of determine what is the probability as a whole to the general U.S. population that you might see that profile. So that's not the actual number in the database. That's sort of taking what we know, we saw this 0 times in this many profiles. So this is sort of the chance of seeing it randomly in that population.
But I guess the main thing is, other than Roy Coons or a male in his paternal line that does not have a mutation, there are no other profiles in the YSTR database that match the profile from this evidence.
Correct.
Thank you.
Ms. Castelbuono, I find it hard to believe that you put statistics in your report that are meaningless. That's not what you did here, is it?
No.
So, did you include statistics in regard to race that have no bearing at all on your research?
The database, as it's used, has been validated published. It's recommended in the field to be used for our purposes. The way YSTR testing works, the way it's inherited, there's really not a better method to estimate how often you might see a profile. However, we still don't expect this profile to happen more commonly than the numbers that I've given. It could be more rare than the numbers that I've given.
But you would still expect it, based on your findings, to occur more often in Asians than in the other 4 races you've listed, according to your statistics.
That's incorrect.
You wouldn't expect it to be more often.
Again, that number is lower because there are less profiles from Asians in the database to begin with.
But your database relies on match probability, does it not?
No, it does not.
That doesn't come into play at all in your report?
The statistic that we report is called the profile probability. Again, that's taking that number 0 and say 28,000, and we use something called a 95% confidence interval. So that means we are 95% confident that that profile will not be more common than the 1 in, say, 2,000. That's called the profile probability.
But you testified not more than an hour ago that it was more likely to see it in an Asian than that profile than it would be in any other races. Have you changed your mind since then?
I may have misspoke in conveying that based on the numbers alone. Yes, 1 in 4,000. I'm sorry, 1,300 is more common than 1 in 2,800. But the profile that I searched, for the one that I'm speaking about in question, was seen 0 times. So if I searched a completely different YSTR profile, I would get those same exact numbers from that database search. Because the size of the database itself limits us in our statistics.
So is your report inaccurate?
No, it's not inaccurate. It's an estimate, which is what I testified to.
And that's an estimate that you rely upon some scientific survey.
Yes, it's like I said, this database in particular has been validated, published, and is approved for use and actually recommended for use in the field.
So you stand behind the numbers as they are in your report?
Yes, because again, they are estimates.
All right, that's all.
Redirect.
None, Your Honor.
All right, thank you again. You're excused. All right, next one.
Corcoran, Louanne Corcoran.
Your Honor, actually, I was going to ask to call my expert one more time when you serve low.
Okay, I mean, might as well do it now.
Might as well. See.
And Mr. Cross, you're also still on oath.
Mr. Cross, regarding this racial issue in the YSDR partial profiles that we've heard about, can you clarify what we just heard from Ms. Castelbuono for the jury?
Yes, what she's describing is the counting method, which is how many times it's seen in the database. But one of the factors that's also in this database is there are differences in the different racial groups. Sometimes some of these alleles are more common than others, and that does play into the match probability and the profile probability. So otherwise, it wouldn't matter how many people you have in your database. If you don't see it, it should be the same. Because if there's no difference in the racial groups, why does it matter? You know, if you're only going by counting numbers, it doesn't matter. Now, the printouts that are in the notes that come from this software that does this calculation also have match probabilities, which is a likelihood ratio of how likely it is to see this profile in a certain racial group. And in this, specifically for sample 8L, in the African American population, it is 1,578 times more likely to be seen. Asian, it is 1,066 times more likely to be seen. Caucasian, 1,796 times more likely. Hispanic, 1,301 times more likely. And Native American, 675 times more likely. So these are actually the numbers of the likelihood of someone in that population. Well, actually, the number is the probability of seeing this profile within that population, not seeing the profile itself. This is accounting for those differences in the genetic anomalies between the races. And they may be subtle. They may not be, huge between the two. But that is also a statistical interpretation that is given in the same printout as the profile probabilities.
And those numbers you're referencing to, is that from the TBI case file?
Yes, it is.
Are those numbers that you came up with yourself?
No, this is actually a printout from the software, from the database itself. When it does the search, it produces a standardized form, and that is the form that is in the case notes.
That's all.
Would you agree with me that whether it is more likely to be found in an Asian population or an African American population or a Caucasian population, one thing we know is it is the same YSTR profile as that man sitting at that table?
The partial profile that was detected for what was detected is consistent with him and any of his paternally linked male relatives.
So let me ask you this. There's been, everybody's into Ancestry.com, and there's been a lot of discussion about DNA, even with our former president, Thomas Jefferson. Are you familiar with those studies?
Yes.
And genealogy? And there's been, I know, many documentaries and discussions about the lineage of potential children of Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
And that analysis has many generations ago, and there are people who one might look at and they might classify themselves as Caucasian, or they might classify themselves as African American, but they can share the exact same YSTR profile if they share that common parental ancestor.
Yes, because it is based on the lineage and not based on the racial group. These are racial groups that are basically self-identified.
Right, so the people who are put in this database may self-identify as being African American, or may self-identify as being Asian, or self-identify as being Caucasian, and that is how it is entered into that population database.
That's correct.
And so that classification is only as good and as accurate as that self-identification.
Yes, that's the case for any sort of databasing where racial characteristics are being done, whether it's YSTRs or STRs. It's all based on basically self-identification, how you would identify yourself on a census.
But the one thing we know that does not rely on self-identification is that on at least one of these partial profiles, no one else in that database has the same YSTR profile as Mr. Roy Coons.
Yes,
Or his relative, parental relative.
that particular family line is not represented in the database.
Thank you.
Anything further?
No.
Thank you. All right. Corcoran now?
Yes, Yes, Your Honor.
Corcoran.
Corcoran. Thank you, Ms. Ross.
And this is, what, chain of custody?
It's just general chain of custody, Your Honor.
All right.
You swear to tell the truth, so help you God.
Would you please state your name and spell your first and last name for the court reporter?
Yes, my name is Louanne Corcoran, Louanne Corcoran,
Ms. Corcoran, where are you employed?
with the Metropolitan Police Department Crime Lab
How long have you been with the crime laboratory?
since March of 2014
And when did the crime laboratory open?
and 2015.
What is your position there?
I'm the evidence receiving supervisor.
Now, when you say you're with the Metro Crime Laboratory, are you a sworn police officer?
No, ma'am, I'm a civilian supervisor,
And how many people do you supervise?
4 technicians.
Prior to your present position, where were you employed?
At the property and evidence section.
For the Metro Police Department?
Yes, ma'am,
And how long were you in that position?
since 2009.
If you could, I'll take you back to your old profession, and as being part of the Metro Lab, do you routinely receive evidence from the Metro property room?
Yes,
And are you familiar with their procedures and the actual physical plant as it is? where
Yes,
it's
ma'am.
Can you just give a little background generally to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury about how evidence is stored, where it is stored, the tracking mechanisms and the security measures that are in place to ensure the integrity of the evidence?
yes. Yes, our property and evidence section is off of East Trinity Lane, and officers and detectives will turn the evidence into the property and evidence section there. And they have locked storage bins there that they will submit the evidence to. And then the supervisors will take out the evidence daily out of these locked storage bins and then turn the evidence over to their technicians daily.
Let me stop you right there. You say they put them into locked storage bins. Once a police officer puts something into those bins, are they able to reach in and pull it back out or pull other items back out of that bin?
No. Yes, these locked storage bins cannot be opened until the next day by the supervisors of the property and evidence storage section. And then they will divide that evidence up amongst the technicians there to be entered into the RMS the RMS computer system. Evidence will be assigned a barcode, which will be the identifying barcode for that piece of evidence.
And does that start usually with the letters PR followed by some sequence of numbers?
Yes. And that will be the identifying barcode for that piece of evidence. And that will be tracked through the RMS computer system for the chain of custody.
And are the area where, can you describe kind of the area of where they are physically stored?
Yes, it is a warehouse that is off of East Trinity Lane that it's stored in. It is a secured warehouse where only police officers can get into the front section. And then only the supervisors and the evidence technicians can get into the back section. If anyone goes into, like officers or anything, they have to sign in to the back section if they need to view evidence or anything like that.
And if attorneys, say if Mr. Hopkins or myself needed in preparation for trial to come look at the evidence, to be prepared, is that secured and are we kept under supervision when we are allowed to view the evidence?
Correct. People have to log in and there's camera systems.
Now, if you would, how typically does evidence get transferred from the property room to the Metro Crime Laboratory for processing once a 282 request form has been filled out?
Once a 282 is filled out, request form, it is sent over to the property room daily. A police officer that is there assigned to the property and evidence room will gather up that evidence. They will ensure that everything is sealed properly, ensure that all the descriptions and complaint numbers match the lab request. It will all be gathered up. Then it will be transferred in the RMS system so that the chain of custody is correct. All that evidence will then be gathered up. That police officer will then transport it in a van over to the crime lab. And then it will be then transferred again over to one of my technicians' custody, then again in that RMS system by that barcode.
And if you could describe where the crime laboratory is and where that evidence, the facility where it is received into your crime lab.
Yes. It will come from the warehouse over on Trinity Lane over to my crime lab, which is over off of Myatt Drive, the Madison precinct.
And is the crime laboratory kept separate from the police precinct building where it's housed?
Correct. We are on the second floor above the Madison precinct. We are totally separate, secure facility. None of the police officer with the property and evidence section does not have access to our crime lab. They will come up to the second floor, but they will be stopped at the back window. So they do not have access into the crime laboratory, only to our back window.
What about, say, the police officer, patrol officer who's stationed to Madison precinct on the first floor? Can that person just come up to where the property is received or where the crime laboratory is?
No, nobody has access to the crime lab. They would have to go to the front lobby and have to be signed in.
Now, when your particular part of the department receives the property and evidence from the property room, how do you catalog that and what do you do to ensure the safety and security of the evidence?
Yes, once the evidence is transferred from the property room in the RMS system, it is then logged into our LIMS system, which is the Laboratory Information Management System. It's a total different computer system. And then we give it another barcode, which is individually gives it another tracking system, another chain of custody system, which is completely separate from theirs and is unique to us.
Where is the evidence stored awaiting the agent being able to physically test it?
We have a separate vault in my unit. We have 2 vaults, and the DNA is kept in its own vault.
Will your particular department accept evidence if it is not appropriately packaged or sealed?
No, we will automatically reject it once we see if there's any errors on it, if it's not sealed properly, initialed, if the complaint numbers do not match, a description doesn't match, we will reject it and send it back to ESS.
And as the supervisor and as, did you actually, were you involved in much of the receiving of the evidence from the Metro Police Property Room?
Yes, I was.
And in this particular case, or in other cases where cases may be time sensitive, can an officer, if their supervisor approves, bypass taking it to the property room and immediately take it to your crime laboratory if an agent is able and willing to begin processing sooner?
Yes.
And in this particular case, did that actually happen on some of those pieces of evidence where it went straight from the crime scene or from the medical examiner's office to your crime laboratory bypassing the property room?
Yes, it did.
And that is an acceptable procedure as well?
Yes, it is.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Any questions?
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Corcoran, so I want to be clear, you're the supervisor of the
Evidence receiving unit.
whole unit, which encompasses not just the storage of the evidence, but also the crime lab.
Not of the whole crime lab, just the evidence receiving unit.
Evidence receiving unit.
Yes, sir.
So you know what kind of testing is done in your crime lab? You oversee the different departments there?
I do not oversee the other units, just my evidence receiving unit.
Okay, and in relation to where the evidence is stored normally, are you over that entire department or just,
No, sir,
just the sending unit?
just my unit.
Have you had occasion to receive evidence from the storage area that could be several years old?
Yes, sir.
Is that uncommon?
No, sir.
So you can take evidence that's been over there for 5, 10, 20 years sometimes.
I've had some several years old, yes, sir.
That's all.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, ma'am, for your excuse. Before we call the next, anybody need a break? I see a couple of here, Bobby. So we'll take a short break, okay, just a short one. No more than 10, but 5 to 10 minutes. Who'll be the next witness, by the way?
Next witness will be Mike Adkins.
All rise. All rise. All right, please be seated. All right, your next witness.
Detective Mike Adkins, Your Honor.
All right.
You swear to tell the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Could you please introduce yourself to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury?
Yes, my name is Michael Adkins. Last name is spelled Adkins. I am a detective with the Metro Nashville Police Department. I am currently assigned to the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force.
Detective Adkins, you are not going to testify about DNA, are you?
I am not.
Thank you. How long have you been with the Metro Police Department?
August will be 21 years.
Could you describe a little bit about what your present assignment is?
Sure. As I said, I'm assigned to the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force. I deal with the child pornography and child exploitation investigations involving the Internet.
And given that assignment, are you perhaps more fluent in computers and in technology than perhaps the average detective would be?
Yes, in the last 11 years, I've been assigned to the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force with the Metro Police Department. I've had specialized training, investigations on the Internet involving computers and how the Internet works and all works together. So that's basically my daily activity.
And on August the 11th of 2017, were you contacted by, which detective were you contacted by? Do you know?
I believe it was my supervisor, Sergeant Rowetter, that actually contacted me and asked me to assist.
And had your supervisor been to a conference, learned about a particular investigative technique?
I believe so, yes, yeah.
And what was that investigative technique?
It had to deal with router interrogation, which is basically a big word for saying getting information off of a home router.
Okay, and that router deals with the internet,
Yes,
which is where you came into this because of your experience with the internet.
that is correct.
And on August the 11th of 2017, were you accompanied by another police officer or detective to a resident at Lot C2 at 1229 Old Dickerson Pike?
Yes, when I got there, I met with the detectives that were there, and they, I think it was Detective Hill, escorted me inside the residence.
And 2 days later, on this next day, on August the 11th of 2017, was that trailer still secured by police presence and security tape around it?
Yes, it was.
When you went into the trailer, what was your purpose?
We were getting information off of the wireless router. Detective Hill went in there with me. We found the router, and we got the Wi-Fi password and the IP address for the router off of the side of the router. Once we got that information, I left the residence.
And what was it that you were looking for in that situation?
The Wi-Fi password would allow me access to the Wi-Fi network at the home, which would allow me access to get into their network. And then the passcode or the IP address for the router would allow me direct access into the router. Therefore, I'd be able to pull off information that was on there, if there was information on there.
Does every person, does every device end up leaving information on a router? How does that work?
Usually, now, you have to understand, all routers are completely different. They leave different information. And by default, when you get a router from the factory, you plug it up, there's a logging function that's on there that would log a whole bunch of information. By default, that information is usually turned off. So a person would have to actually go into their router and turn logging on. If they turn that on, there could be a treasure trove of information, including all the websites that were went to, when they were went to, what device actually asked for that information, all that stuff, when it was accessed. All that information could still be on there as long as the router wasn't turned off. But the whole internet turned off and the router turned off. But the only way to find that out is to actually access the router and find out if it's turned on or off, and then see what information would actually be on there.
And what in particular were you looking for?
We were trying to find any devices that was connected to the internet, when they may have been connected, and see if logging had been turned on to see what sites may have been accessed around the time when they believe this crime occurred.
Would that be, say, if a person had gone in there committing a crime and they had accessed their Wi-Fi or done a search for something or other types of usage?
Yes, but they would have to be connected to their network. So they would have to know, since it's a secured network, it requires a passcode, they would have to know the passcode to get into it. It's not going to show you all the devices that are actually trying to connect to it, because your Wi-Fi is turned on all the time. You're always searching for a Wi-Fi network to connect to. Unless you make the connection, that it's not going to show up. It's not going to show that this device was trying to connect to it.
So if I, as a stranger, had come in there with my phone and walked in and, say, tried to pull up a Google Maps situation, if I didn't have that passcode to connect to their Wi-Fi, you would have no information left behind by me.
No, from my understanding, there would be no information. Your device would not show up. You wouldn't even be there.
And when you did this, were you able to determine any information from checking the router out?
We were able to find devices that had been connected to it. We were able to find which devices were still connected. There were 3 devices that were connected. One was mine, the Surface tablet that I was using to connect to it. One was a cell phone, and one was an Xbox that was inside the residence. Those were the only ones that were actively on the network, and then there were a few that were no longer active, not connected to that network anymore.
So you had nothing indicating someone outside the family had accessed within that trailer?
No, from what I understand, the list of items that I provided to him were all devices that belong to the family.
Have you ever attempted this investigative technique on any other cases?
No, this is the first time I've been asked to try to do something like this.
Thank you very much.
So Detective Adkins, in relation to this case, you have nothing to add?
No, sir.
Anything further?
Nothing further, Judge.
Thank you, Detective.
Thank you,
Haven't
sir.
seen you in a while.
It has been a while, sir.
Please. Next witness.
Mark Rosenfeld.
Thank you.
You swear to tell the truth, so help you God?
State and spell your name, please.
Mark Rosenfeld, Markrosenfeld.
And what do you do for a living?
Crime scene investigator with Metro Nashville Police Department.
Officer or civilian?
Officer.
Officer Rosenfeld, how long have you been in that position?
I've been in this position for about 6 years.
Very briefly, does that position as a crime scene investigator involve training and education about collection of evidence, processing evidence, stuff like that?
It does.
Describe that just as briefly as you can.
With the collection of evidence, we generally place, we'll photograph it first so we don't disturb it, and then from there, after we photograph it, we'll tend to place it in a single-use bag. Most of the time it's paper because it will maintain DNA.
On August 11th of 2017, were you working in this position?
I was.
Were you called to process some evidence in this case?
I was.
On that date, what were you asked to process?
On the, you said the 11th?
Yes.
Yeah, on the 11th, I was requested to process an iPad with earbuds.
Okay, and what did you do with the iPad and earbuds?
The iPad was visually inspected, it was photographed, then from there I processed it with single-use powder to maintain DNA, and then I swabbed any possible prints that I had.
Explain what single-use powder is.
Single-use powder is a sealed powder for that's used for listing fingerprints, but it's not touched by anything else. It's DNA-free and clean. So we'll open it up, use all the single-use equipment, including brush, and then as soon as that's done, we'll throw that equipment away.
And what's the purpose of using the powder on the iPad?
It was to develop fingerprints.
And were you able to develop any fingerprints?
With the iPod, I did develop fingerprints.
What about the earbuds?
The earbuds, I was swabbed for DNA.
Swab the iPad for DNA also?
Sorry.
Did you swab the iPad for DNA also?
I did.
What do you do with those swabs from the iPad and the earbuds?
The swabs are collected, they're put into actual sealed together, just the swabs in particular. Then from there, they are packaged and then sent to the crime lab.
And I think you already said this, but you also took photos of those items.
I did.
Okay. I want to take you to the next date that you process stuff, and then we'll go through the photos after that, okay?
Okay.
Did you, on August 28th, did you process some evidence in this case?
I did.
Without saying what you did first, just list the things that you processed.
There was a thing of toilet paper, a purse, a box, disinfectant spray, toothpaste, a cleaner in a spray bottle, lotion, a hair remover box, finishing oil, and a doorbell cover.
With all of those items, what did you do with those?
They would have been, some of them would have been processed for fingerprints, DNA, stuff like that.
Okay, let's go through them really quickly. The toilet paper, what did you do with that?
With that one, I would process it for DNA and fingerprints. The only weird step I did was I used leucocrystal violet, which will react to blood. It's a dye and fixative. And if there's any trace amounts of blood, it will actually react. It does fairly nice fingerprints.
What was your results?
With that, I did not get any fingerprints.
And
I do believe I also have here, though, at least with the powder, no fingerprints. With leucocrystal violet, I had comparison quality photos.
so you took photos of those?
Photos,
And then swabbed it for DNA.
correct.
What about the purse?
The purse, I did not get any fingerprints.
Swabbed it for DNA?
That was for DNA and then processed for fingerprints, yes.
And also photographed?
Yes.
What about the body series box?
The box I photographed and processed for latent prints with negative results on the prints.
So no prints?
No.
What about the disinfectant spray?
Disinfectant spray was processed for latent prints with no results.
Photographs of that?
I do believe I have photographs of that, yes.
How about the toothpaste?
The toothpaste was also processed for latent prints with negative results.
And photographs of that?
Yeah.
Cleaner in the spray bottle?
The cleaner and spray bottle was photographed and processed for latent prints. I did get latent prints from that.
So far, the things that you got latents from were the leucocrystal latents on the toilet paper,
Mm-hmm.
and the cleaner in the spray bottle. No other latents so far.
Correct, and the iPad, I believe I had some.
And just to explain, because I don't think we've talked about it yet in this case, what is a latent print?
Latent print is generally it's a print that's deposited on a surface from just contact itself. We process it with powder that I explained earlier.
What about the lotion?
The lotion was photographed and processed for prints with the actual prints developed.
Okay. The hair remover box?
Hair removal box was processed for prints with no prints developed.
The finishing oil?
Finishing oil was photographed and processed for prints with no prints developed.
And finally, the doorbell cover?
Doorbell cover was photographed and processed for prints, no prints developed, and then it was also swabbed for DNA.
I know you already said this with respect to the iPad, but for those items with respect to the latent prints that you developed and the swabs for DNA, did you securely package those and submit those to property?
Yes.
I'm going to pass you a packet of photographs. You could just thumb through those and flip out once you're done. Do you recognize what those are?
Those are photographs that I took at the crime lab.
We'd ask that the hard copy of those photos be made the state's next exhibit.
All right, number 26.
And Your Honor, I have digital versions that I'd like to publish to the jury.
Okay.
And Officer Rosenfeld, we're just going to go through these pretty quick. What is this, this first photo of?
This is a photo work order. It's usually the first photo we take of when doing anything. It'll have your date, time, the report number that we're using, the 10 code that we use, where we're at, which is 400 miles at our office, what the item is, which is evidence, and then it'll also have my name.
So obviously that's useful so that later on you can see who took the photos and what day and stuff
Right.
like that, and what case it's associated with.
And it gives you a rough time of when you're taking pictures and everything else.
Okay, next photo. What is this?
This would be a iPad with earbuds.
Next photo. What's this photo show?
That's a closer picture of the iPad,
And this?
the backside of it.
This?
That would be the same iPad, but it has a serial number.
And those are?
The earbuds that were attached.
What's this photo showing?
Right here, it's showing a stain that's on it.
Is that part of the stain that you swabbed
It would be.
here?
And that would be a different stain on the same earbud.
Was it also swabbed?
It is.
And this is showing the iPad again, but what is this showing?
This is showing some of the fingerprint powder that's on the back of it.
And this?
That would be, if you look closely right around here, you can actually see some of the ridge detail from the latent print.
So when you said you were able to find a latent print and photographed it, this would be the photograph of that?
Yeah.
Next photo. Another view of that fingerprint?
It's a little different angle, yeah.
Next photo. What is this?
This would be the toilet paper, and that would be sitting there with a scale next to it.
What's the purpose of the scale?
The scale is so we can have a general size. We use a scale for everything so that you can have something to compare it to.
In this photo, another view of the toilet paper roll?
Yes, that's the other side.
And what is this photo showing?
That would be what looks to be a blood stain on it, or just a stain in particular.
Next photo. And this,
It's the other side of it.
and what's this showing?
And that would be the bottom of the tissue.
And the next photo is of the outside of an evidence package. Why is that?
That's the packaging that the toilet paper came in.
Okay, next photo. Same thing.
Correct, that's the other side.
And what is this?
This is a smaller scale. It's an inch scale with that stain that was on the toilet paper.
Next photo. Now, is this the crystal
Yes, this
method that you
the
use to photograph?
leucocrystal violet.
Okay. What's this?
This would be the package for the purse.
Next photo.
That would be the backside of it.
Okay. And what is this?
That would be the purse.
Next photo.
That's the other side of it.
Okay.
And that's the contents.
Just keep going.
That's all the contents laid out that were in the purse.
Okay.
It just shows a closer picture of the contents. That's the other contents.
Okay.
That would be writing that was on the purse that you saw earlier. And this is the body series box that was mentioned earlier. It's just a picture of it and a different side.
What's this one?
The disinfectant spray,
Okay.
that would be the toothpaste.
Okay.
And that's the cleaner spray bottle bag. That's the backside. There's the cleaner spray. That would be buttercream. Buttercream. Sorry, I was looking away trying to figure out what it was. And that would be the doorbell. And the backside of the doorbell.
Ask that this disc of these digital photos be entered into the evidence as the next exhibit, Your Honor.
All right,
And those are all my questions for Officer Rosenfeld.
all right.
I didn't hear any specific numbers related to those photographs, so I don't know if it's going to be clear on the record.
Number 26 is the exhibit number.
Elected, but when he was saying doorbell, this or that, were there any specific numbers associated with those?
There is on the disc and on the back of the photographs.
Is there a description in the writing on the disc about what's in that, in the file name?
There is the name of Rosenfeld photos.
Officer Rosenfeld, just a few questions. These items items you photographed and tested were not on the scene, they were from the scene. Is that
Those
right?
were from the scene, they were packaged, taken to the property room, and then brought to us at that point.
Okay, so did you actually respond to that scene on 8/11/2017?
No,
Collecting evidence? You weren't involved?
I was not involved in that portion.
That's all.
Anything further?
Nothing further.
All right, thank you. Who's your next witness?
It would be Lynn Mace, Your Honor, but we need to have a very short, just a couple of photographs.
I didn't hear you.
Need to have the court make a ruling on a couple of photographs of visibility.
Okay, all right. I'm gonna need, well, we can do it right here.
Yes, good.
Okay, what is today, Wednesday? This is something, we're gonna go ahead and stop for today. We've heard a lot today, and we have some more to hear tomorrow. So we're gonna get a fresh start in the morning. Don't oversleep, okay? I know you'll all be here about 8:45 in the morning. We'll see you then. Do not communicate anything and enjoy your evening, all right? All right. See you in the morning, folks. We'll have a copy of the charge tomorrow as well to review, for you to review.
Thank you, Judge.
The court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9.